We are now in chapter 7 of the book by Oliphant, and he begins this chapter, as he has begun so many chapters in his book, with a quote from Bavinck. You can tell he likes Bavinck and Van Til. These are all Dutch theologians, as he himself is a Dutch theologian, so I'm sure there's a kind of family affinity there. And it's a nice quote, maybe not quite as dramatic as some of the other quotes from Bavinck at the headings of the book, but nonetheless quite interesting. This book is different from probably most books you've read on apologetics, unless you have somewhere along the way stumbled across Van Til or that school of thought. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted us to read this book. It's a little different take on the whole subject of apologetics than you would get from someone like William Lane Craig or C.S. Lewis or others who are not part of the presuppositional school. He begins here in this chapter by talking about idol worship and takes us to Acts chapter 17. And as he begins to unpack Acts chapter 17, he makes a comparison of the false teachers in Athens with the story of Bizarro. Now, I'm a comic book aficionado. Was never a big Superman fan, but fairly early in the Superman saga, Bizarro was sort of the anti-Superman that had to fight, or that Superman had to fight. So it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it there. He tells us in the bottom of 226 that Paul begins his address to the philosophers at Mars Hill with the statement, "You are very religious." And he points out in this chapter that the word religious at that point is what we might call a value neutral term. It could mean something positive, it could mean something negative. Similarly, as it would in English as well. And so this probably left the philosophers with some amount of conversation, even at the beginning, sort of whispering among themselves, what does he mean by that? What does he mean by that? We've all had conversations with groups of people, and you can see some on the fringe saying, what does he mean by that, or what does she mean by that? And so he talks about how what Paul does here is to present both a positive, begins with a negative apologetic, and then moves on to a positive apologetic. And so he begins here with what Oliphant has called in an earlier chapter the quicksand quotient. Now, I like that phrase. The concept is not new, and the concept is probably not new to you either. The concept is that as a part of the apologetic task, you lead people who hold to another worldview or religion into a discussion of their faith or their belief system to the point where they suddenly get mired down and are unable to make any more progress in asserting the truthfulness of their worldview. So you take them, you grab them by the hand and take them into the jungle until you've wandered into the quicksand, and then you let them sink. And that's pretty much what he's going to do in this chapter as he deals with the Muslim person that he is having a dialogue with. He talks about the difference between census and suppression. Census is having a sense of the fact that God is real, but a suppression of some of the truth about God. That's on 228, 229. And this is, I think, a common experience that many of us have. We have had conversations with people who say, oh, I believe in God, or the man upstairs, or the big guy in the sky, or JC and the boys, or whatever else they may be attempting to defend. But then when it comes to actually stating what they believe, they wind up with a reductionistic view of God, or a simply distorted view of God. That's the suppression element in it. And so, and on page 230, he talks about a recipe for covenantally defending the faith among and with other religions. And he says there are three basic categories that we need to keep in mind. The first is that we have to be aware of exactly who the God of the other religion is. And what that entails, of course, is some research. That's part of why you're taking this series of courses, to try to understand who it is that you're up against, if you want to put it that way. And once you understand who you're up against and what you're up against, you could do something about it. So in most religions, you're dealing with an understanding of God. And it's at that point that the discussion needs to really begin. He also makes the point this is more difficult in Buddhism, and though he doesn't explain it here, that's because in Buddhism, classical Buddhism, there is no God. So you'd have to look at it from the standpoint of what is their view of ultimate reality. Second thing to do is to deal with God's interpretation to creation. What are his attributes? And specifically, what are his attributes that enable him to relate to creation? Now, that's going to become an important point in the dialogue with the Muslim that's related in this chapter. And then the third thing we do is that we attempt to understand something of the false religion's theology of revelation. How do they know what they know? Most religions have a book, though they don't all treat the book in the way that we do. If you were to read Confucius's writings, or Lao Tse, or a number of other Eastern texts, especially even the Vedas of Hinduism, they don't function in quite the same way as an inspired inerrant text. They're more religious poetry that sort of invokes a sense of feeling and a sense of dependence, but that's about as far as it goes. So anyway, the idea of the other religion's understanding of revelation. He mentions here just off the cuff in a conversation he had with a guy named Lawrence, who was a Jehovah's Witness, and how Lawrence began by, was by himself and began by simply quoting John 1:1 out of the New World Translation of the Bible. He doesn't mention that in here, but that's essentially what he was doing. I've had this conversation with many Jehovah's Witnesses. You probably have as well. And so he said at first, him being a first-year seminary student, he attempted to deal with this at the level of grammar. But somehow he realized that wasn't going to do any good for Lawrence. He might have been beaten up a little bit by a prospective convert, but that would be about it. So he appealed to what he sensed was the need of the moment, which was Lawrence's sense of insecurity. And he said he doesn't know what happened to him, but you never know in encountering somebody from another religion or a new religious movement, as they now call cults. Used to be cults, now it's new religious movements. That sometimes is the best way to try to reach out to someone. Now, I'm not going to go through and relate this entire dialogue or even much of the dialogue between him and the Muslim. But if you'll kind of pay attention as you go through this, he follows the pattern that he attempted to lay out a while ago. Who is God? What is God's relation to creation? And how do we perceive of the revelation of God? And then does that really satisfy the inner needs that we have in our own personal spiritual lives? It's the longest of all of the dialogues, I think, in the book. And this is obviously a very smart Muslim with some philosophical training, probably smarter than you and I would normally meet on the street. But nonetheless, I think it's a very helpful thing to read, especially if you're in a Muslim community or any religious community where you're trying to make some kind of inroads, a knowledge of the sort of things. And that's really what he's doing here. Not necessarily telling us this is how you do apologetics, as this is the spirit in which you do apologetics. You're not going to find more evidence that demands a verdict, not to be disparaging of the old Josh McDowell book. I have that book and have read it probably cover to cover several times. But nonetheless, the attitude that we have and the sense of what we're trying to accomplish in apologetics, I think that Oliphant helps us with that very much.